Welcome, everyone, to the Religion Unplugged podcast, your one-stop shop for all the best religious news and culture. I'm Religion Unplugged's film and culture critic, Joseph Holmes, and I'm here with my colleague, Jillian. Jillian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Jillian Cheney. I'm the culture editor at Religion Unplugged.
That's right. She is my just above me boss. And so I'm going to be especially nice to her as we're talking about the Oscars again this year.
Good.
And with us also is my good friend, Houston. Houston, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey, I'm Houston. I am I need to think of a succinct, maybe culture critic might be, but it feels a little bit pretentious sometimes when you say, I don't know, yeah.
What was it, like theme park critic? Like, yes, what was it, theme park thing
I often say theme park theologian or movie philosophizer. Right, yeah. Either way, I tend to write about movies and culture. I've written for The Rabbit Room and Mere Orthodoxy and my own Substack, Houston, We Have a Problem. And I have a YouTube channel that's also my name, Houston Coley. And I'm a documentary filmmaker. I made a movie this past year called A Kingdom of Tea and Strangers. And that's what I'm...
And it's very good. Yeah. If you get a chance to check it out, it really is great.
Thanks.
So yeah, of course. So we are all religious people and the Oscars have just come out. So every year, Jillian and I make sure that because, Oscars are like our football. We make sure that we check out the nominations exactly when they happen. And of course, at the Religion Unplugged podcast, we have a tradition of going over the Oscar nominations and looking at what they're saying culturally and specifically culturally around issues of faith and religion. We've done this for a few years now. We'll do this in writing and do this in podcast form. But I want to bring on Houston this year because this is, really cool and really interesting. And we've all kind of been posting online about some of our different thoughts about it, where the Oscars are indicating where culture is going and how it thinks about religion. I've often talked about the fact that I think that because the Oscars, it goes through so many levels. You have the creatives who are involved, and then you have the business, the people who fund the movies, and then you have the critics who, value the movies, and then you have the Oscars, which are kind of giving awards to these movies to, industry professionals there's a lot of different pieces of the pie of people that you have to go through at different communities of our culture makers you have to go through before you kind of get to what is nominated. So that's why I always find it interesting to kind of evaluate where our culture is based on these. Anyway, that's my, justification for getting a chance to spend time with my friends talking about the Oscars with all of you. So today we're going to kind of go this a little bit of a format. We're going to be talking about the Oscars in general and where we think kind of one of the big headlines is about the nominations that have come out. Then we're going to go specifically through how they portray religion and what that says. And then, of course, we're going to go into the movie Conclave, because that movie is full on religious. And boy, has that developed some religious cultural controversy. So we're going to have a lot of fun with that. So first, start off, Houston, when you saw the list of Oscar nominations this year, what was your kind of headline first reaction as you were seeing what got picked?
Well, first, I would want to comment on what you said about the Oscars and culture. I think is very right. It's funny that has been part of that kind of mentality has been part of my life for a long time, because my dad gives kind of a big TED Talk-esque thing every year about what the Oscars are saying about culture, and specifically often kind of looking at, okay, what are the common themes that are shared between these movies and what might they be telling us about not just kind of where we've come from, but where we're going. And it's yielded quite a few interesting results. So I have been having a lot of conversations with him. His name is Brian Coley, in the past few months. And he and I have been talking often about how many of the movies nominated this year feature an aspect of a chosen one character, or a character who's kind of lifted up on a pedestal or something, who starts as kind of an outsider, becomes an insider, and then rejects that status by the end of the movie. So you kind of see it with Bob Dylan in his movie, where, he's kind of starts out as a nobody and then becomes this big kind of folk hero, and then eventually kind of rebels against that system. The ending of A Complete Unknown is almost the exact same ending as Wicked with Defying Gravity, where it's like kind of singing the song you're not supposed to sing, rebelling against the kind of established whatever. I think you could say there's a little bit of that in Conclave, maybe not a ton. Amelia Perez, there's kind of like a someone who's an established, like the character is like a drug lord who kind of rejects that status to then be kind of a folk hero in a different way. And there's probably a couple other ones that I'm missing. Oh, Dune, of course, is kind of, Paul Atreides embracing the banner of the Muad'Dib, but also kind of like alienating himself from Chani in that process and all of these things. So yeah, maybe I'll think of other things. So that's sort of
Honora, she tries to become part of mainstream society, but is then rejected. She's actually rejected by that society.
Yeah, totally.
Even
exactly.
Like the Brutalist, Toth is kind of the way that at least he views himself and his projects is like, I'm the only one who can do this. I'm the only one who can do this my way. Like I'm, I guess kind of an unconventional chosen one, but absolutely there too. This kind of, yeah. I mean, he's literally, it's almost like him being chosen by Guy Pearce's, what's the guy, Van Buren, is like Elphaba being chosen by the wizard, like sort of this, and even Honora being chosen by, what's the guy's name in that? Ivan? Yeah.
Yeah, something like,
Vanya,
exactly.
Vanya, yeah.
That's right, yeah.
So she's kind of chosen by a Wizard of Oz in her own way kind of thing, and then sort of eschewing that by the end. I think that's pretty interesting. So that's some of my thoughts, although my gut thought was, oh my gosh, I can't believe Challengers didn't get any nominations. But
you and Jillian will get along so well.
That I was going to say, I mean, please feel free to jump in with any further thoughts you have, but that's the segue into mine is when my first reaction when I saw the list was, so nothing for Challengers, like nothing?
Not even score. Not even score.
Not even score. Yeah. I think as a critic, as critics, we have these movies that we have personal connections to, or just movies that we like. And this year was the first in a while that I've had a movie that I cared very deeply about be snubbed, as they say. And so it's like, well, whatever. But I do think, of course, like there are a bunch of great movies in this list, some mediocre movies in this list, but that's how it always goes. I think it's really interesting, like what they have to say. I think the thing that I have noticed as well, which I think Joseph and I talk about almost every time that we get together on a podcast, is how religion is becoming more common as more commonly integrated in movies in a way that is not inconsequential, but in a way that's just very casual, that doesn't necessarily manhandle the narrative, so to speak. Like the Jewish narrative through The Brutalist. Very crucial part of the story, but also just kind of in the background, kind of a B plot even. There's, the scene in the church in Honora that is more to build like the culture of the characters and the narrative of the characters than it is to make any statement about religion. So I think things like that. And then, of course, there are other things like Dune, that whole franchise, and the books that they're based off are based on religion and all of that. Conclave, of course. But I think it's interesting too how religion kind of has become a more commonly discussed and maybe more accepted to discuss.
Yeah,
in
normalized
movies.
is the word kind of I would use what you're talking about. Yeah, like you said, in The Brutalist, like they don't focus a lot on the protagonist's kind of Jewish faith, but they just show him in synagogue and getting help, finding a job from somebody there, and getting immigration and stuff like that. So it's an integrated part of those stories.
Yeah. And not being like the point of it being integrated into those stories is not to deconstruct religion. I mean, which isn't, I remember seeing the trailer for Conclave and being like, is this going to be, I mean, you could make a pretty warranted movie that goes against the corruption of the Catholic Church. But it kind of isn't that. Like it is about the egos of men and the fallenness of men, but at the end of the day, it takes faith very seriously and takes the purpose and like significance of the church in the world very seriously, and never kind of questions that. Like that's a given of the movie. And so that's one of the things that I loved about Conclave, is just the sheer like kind of faith blending.
Yes, well, that's one of the things the director mentioned, is that what appealed to him about the movie is that it's about centers of power and the battles that go on in there. It could have happened in a boardroom or in politics, they said, but in here it's about religion. So where I kind of was with it, it was interesting to me. I love your kind of chosen one and outsider insider got there, because I was looking at this and immediately what I saw as something very extremely talked about in our culture right now, but not as universal in Best Picture nominees that I've seen before, but is this distinction between the virtuous marginalized and the corrupt mainstream. Because like you said, almost all the heroes come from the outskirts of society and are, to some degree, are virtuous protagonists. You have, of course, you have Elphaba, you have whatever it's Jewish immigrants, you have the, Honora, you have all these characters that come from the outsiders, and they're kind of our heroes that we sympathize with and want to do something good. And then, of course, they either come in or get invited in to the mainstream that, that then either spits them out, or they have to try to, fight it or reform it in some way. In typically, you look at something in the past, like, last year's Oppenheimer, which is about somebody who is Jewish, but he is an insider, and he is kind of wrestling with his, culture and the good and the bad of it. But there is this kind of sense in which he sees himself as an insider wanting his culture to live up to its best ideals. In this, there is much more of a sense in which the mainstream doesn't have best ideals, and it needs to be changed by an outsider with different ideals. It's kind of funny, like one of the movies that was floated this year as a Best Picture nominee but didn't get it was Gladiator 2, which didn't deserve it because it wasn't that good a movie. But what's interesting is the villain in that actually said, there is no dream of Rome, it's only a fiction. And it really seems like the theme of the Oscars in many ways is that there is no dream, let's say, of the West or America. There's a fiction of it. And that doesn't actually exist within the mainstream. Like even, something like The Substance, it's like, okay, the culture is misogynist. There's no kind of like within this a more positive vision that can come from within it. It either has to come from outside of it, or it can't exist there at all, which is really interesting for a lot of reasons, sort of culturally, where we are, because that's sort of, you have, even like in Conclave, we'll get to that kind of a moment. There's this idea that the church will be good once it changes. It's the reformers who are the good guys, at least when they're living up to their ideals. And it's the traditionalists who are the bad guys when they're living up to their ideals of kind of turning back the clock. So which is an really interesting to say, because, for a lot of reasons. One of them is because that's sort of the dividing line culturally, politically, kind of we are right now. Are we we have to change, become better in the future? Or is it a make such and so great again kind of, view of the world?
It was dawning on me as you were saying that it's interesting how this sort of, obviously there's this perception in America that even probably has some roots in the Bible and roots in religious tradition of obviously like the idea being the hero is the marginalized one. And so then both sides compete to say, no, actually I'm the marginalized one.
Yes.
And so interestingly, like, I look at these movies and on the surface, I see a lot of stories that quite on face value would be like critiquing the kind of MAGA movement, Trump presidency stuff. You've got the kind of villain of Tedesco who's totally Trump Pope in Conclave. The wizard in Wicked, I think, is a pretty good Trump analog. And, kind of the way that pairs with kind of like the scapegoating of marginalized groups as the biggest problem of society with the animals in Wicked and all that kind of thing. But then at the same time, I look at that and go, but I think the people who supported Trump see him as Elphaba and him as Honora and him as Bob Dylan and as sort of that outsider who's coming to shake up the entire system and, kind of disrupt the mainstream corruption and that sort of thing. And I don't know how to, that's an interesting thing about
it is
movies in general being like,
sorry,
it's just so subjective. Like I watched Wicked and I thought to myself, how could anyone not think that this is like such an obvious kind of like critiquing the MAGA movement, like kind of parable almost. But yet you can read it the exact opposite way. So.
Right. Well, and this is interesting. I mean, this is what happened with the whole red pill analogy coming from The Matrix. I don't know if you remember that, the Wachowskis, when they made The Matrix, later on, the red idea of, popping a red pill, seeing the world as it really is, said, it was taken up by people like, famously Elon Musk said you have to get red pilled. And then, of course, the Wachowskis on Twitter were like, shut up, like, don't you appropriate our thing. And of course, what I found humorous about that was the fact that it's like, you literally told people that we're controlled by, being brainwashed by culture, and you have to break out of that to see things as they really are. You made a whole movie about that. You didn't think that other people didn't think you were the establishment. Mm-hmm. So it is really, you're right, art can be really subjective in that way. Yeah. I do think that
it does speak
Oscar nominees is a little bit harder to do that with, because it's, again, a little bit more explicit. Yeah. Like, again, all of the sort of marginalized people here, again, are very either female coded or, or racially coded or queer coded or things like that. It's a lot kind of hard to do that, but you're right. Dune, and I'll let you want to hear your thoughts on this, Jillian, before we kind of go into more specifically religious territory and then Conclave. But one of the things I think is, interesting is that Dune Part 2 is one of the most fascinating movies about this, because you can actually find people divided. I joked on Twitter that the two political sides in America are, do you think that Paul is the hero or the villain of Dune Part 2? Because there are legitimately people I follow who are like, yes, I know that Denis Villeneuve did not intend for Paul to be a hero, but I see him as the hero in this story. And because, again, you have this person who is, you have Chani, who is, again, female and female person of color and part of the marginalized group. And then you have the white male hero who comes from that culture, but still has problems with that culture and wants to ascend and make things right. And he's got the traditional male hero's journey story, which is being questioned and deconstructed by the female person of color. It's like, this is the dividing line of our politics right now. Not that they see the facts of the movie of who's the hero and who's the villain of the story. Wicked is a little bit different, like, because it is actually more old school in the fact that it's a bit broader, so it's a little easier to, and it wasn't like done before Trump, like originally, so you can do it a little bit. But so Jillian, I want to kind of get to you. It's like, what you brought this up about the kind of how religion is sort of normalized in here in various aspects. Yeah. And I really like that. But if you were to find kind of other themes about how religion tends to be portrayed in this and where it breaks down, what would you see as sort of some of the themes that you're seeing this year pop up?
Yeah, I mean, Dune, again, so interesting. And I think, so I've only read the first Dune book. And I haven't read further. I know that they get crazy. But I mean, that's kind of what you mentioned is kind of that's the struggle of the books. Like, that's what Frank Herbert kind of, his whole theme is, like, is the chosen one the hero or the villain? And I think that the movies do that too. Like, the movies are intentionally ambiguous because the books were intentionally ambiguous and the theme is intentionally ambiguous. I think something that's interesting is, like, when we're looking at the chosen one of Jesus, like, I don't think that anybody ever could say, oh, I think Jesus was a villain. Like, I think that he's kind of beyond reproach in that way. Like, I don't really think there's anything that you could say to cancel Jesus. But I do think
he healed a lot of people, and that's ableist.
Right. But no, I think, other chosen ones, like when you talk about cult figures or political leaders or whoever, there is this idea of like, is this the hero or is this the villain of the narrative? Because they're bringing change, they're putting people to a cause, they're, shaking up the norm of like whatever thing that they're going after. I think like Dune is also kind of a colonial narrative, and so that is the thing that makes him the villain. That in some ways there is like he has a group of people that's coming in and taking over another group of people, and so it's very much that as well. And I think that, and it, there's kind of the discussion is like, well, he's like he is the chosen one, and there's no doubt about that, but like he's instructed by like as part of his directive as the chosen one to like do bad things. I think it's really interesting, and I think it's something that again, like I love that type of like nuance and ambiguity, but I think the downfall of that is like, especially on Twitter, and this is not against you for posting, but rather just the culture of Twitter, is that like people will watch a movie one time and then decide like, oh, he's the hero or oh, he's the villain. And it's like, well, no, like the point is that you're supposed to think about it and maybe even rewatch it and like, whatever. But, and I don't know, not to say that you have to see a movie 5 times before you can comment on it, but I think especially like when we get to these movies that are cultural touch points or nominated for Oscars and like decided as the best movies of the year, like they deserve that nuance and that consideration and that like connection to real world religion, like real life. Like, and I think that there are very few people who are kind of engaging with movies that way. And that is kind of disappointing to me because it's also fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel it's as you were even just talking about it, and I was thinking about the ending of Dune in my head, I was going, man, that ending of part 2 really just feels quite prophetic towards like where we are right now to me. I don't know. I'm probably tipping my hand a little bit on like where I stand politically or something. Maybe we're supposed to say a little bit. Like,
if people look up what your Twitter account, then they'll find out pretty quickly.
Exactly. But I think about, I wrote a short Letterboxd review when I saw the movie, I think for the second or third time, where the character of Stilgar, Javier Bardem's character in Dune Part 2. And the first time that I saw it, I kind of thought, he's a little bit, like he feels a bit more cartoonish in this version than Part 1. He was kind of played for comic relief a little bit as kind of this like, he's just like he believes in the prophecy, like he's the kind of religious
believer,
fundamentalist uncle almost, and yet to me one of the most poignant images of the end of the movie is when he's like zealously getting all the troops onto the ships to go fight this holy war in space. And it's just such a heartbreaking image to me. Like you're sort of watching this people like losing their entire cultural identity of like even the planet that they belong to go fight this like jihad crusade across the galaxy, and seeing this kind of like zealousness like consume his character, and then like really resonating with that final like grieved expression that Shawnee has at the end of the movie and just being like, where did we go wrong, and yet also feeling that, like you were mentioning, it's so much more complicated than a traditional Avatar storyline or something, or even like kind of, it's a white savior narrative, it's not a white savior narrative, chosen one, not chosen one, because it's also like the people who were the oppressed people of the Fremen go on to become the oppressors, and yet also you want liberation for them from their oppressors, and the Harkonnens who are oppressing them are like pretty stereotypically evil. And yeah, it just, in that way Dune is interesting because it's I feel like the more I sit with it, the more I'm like, this is a really nihilistic like vision of reality a little bit, but it's also kind of a very good cautionary tale, I guess.
Yeah. No, there's a lot you can do there. And I appreciate the fact that the movie has enough layers like that. Again, the more I watch the movie, actually, the more I love it. Again, I was kind of like iffy on it when I first watched it, and the more I watch it, the more it changes to be much more positive. And I definitely I've had arguments with people about the movie. Does the movie side, how ambiguous is the movie? Because, every time we watch it, it's like every time Paul does something, it cuts to a picture of Chani, where it's like, what is she seeing? What is she, her emotions, her feelings, her thoughts on what he's doing, her moral gaze is kind of like the emotional underpinning of it. And the more that throughout the third act, we see, him make certain choices that draw him away from her, he's being drawn away from us until the final thing we see is her face at the end. And of course, like you said, Stilgar is far away from us towards the end in the final shot we see of him. So it definitely seems like the movie's perspective is sort of siding with Sir Chani on this. But again, he does it so well that you can actually still have a different experience than even maybe the director wants you to, which I think is one of the things that makes it such a cool movie. Okay, now one comment I'll make sort of about the religion at large, and we can transition to the conclave, is one of the things I see as an interesting theme in here, and we see this sort of in the others, is, again, part of this whole mainstream versus marginalized is that the mainstream in here, the religion tends to be commented sort of negatively, again, when it's a part of the mainstream establishment. It tends to be sort of positive when, again, it's changing the mainstream or it is outside the mainstream. So again, like in Anora, like, you see the one guy who's being a priest and he's, okay, is the corrupt sort of, bad guy who's working for the Russian oligarchs is, literally taking off his vestments to go and not doing his duties so that he can go do their bidding. You have, again, the sort of the help that, that's protagonist, a brutalist, is getting from his Jewish religious community, and the kind of marginalization, oppression he's getting from the Christian and Catholic communities. So you have a lot of those running themes going out where religion can be a part of the establishment and mainstream, and therefore kind of be part and parcel with it, or it could be part of the marginalized, helping to change things. But it's still like that dichotomy seems fairly consistent, which is interesting, which makes Dune so interesting, because most of the movies before have said, okay, someone from the inside can actually change this and make this better. And that it's, what is it? It's like Braveheart. It's like, okay, look, I became one of the educated class here, and now I'm going to use that on the side of my oppressed peoples. But Dune is saying, no, that actually can't happen, because there's something actually intrinsically corrupting about the mainstream, that somebody who's too far into it can't actually change it in that way.
And Wicked is a bit that way too.
Yeah.
That she kind of just leaves, by the end of part 2, just kind of flees Oz, basically. Like there's no kind of cultural, redeeming of the land of Oz and all this kind of stuff. It's just like, well, witches are always going to be shunned. And
right, which brings us to, which is why, funnily enough, Conclave is one of the more optimistic, of the movies, because it does the idea that actually there is hope and it can be changed in various different ways. Now, before we get into that, so I'll give you Houston, a chance to do one of your slight rants, because I'm going to quote from a particular person who decided to watch Conclave. So one of the big news stories was that around this Oscar season Conclave was Megyn Kelly, who's a news political commentator, went on to watch Conclave and then criticized it as a quote unquote disgustingly anti-Catholic film. I won't go into it's a long quote, I won't go into it. Basically criticized it for portraying Catholics as very horrible, all corrupt or evil, and criticizing the ending. Spoilers for everybody. This is a spoiler thing we have to do. So spoilers, because the end of it, the new pope is intersex, and that's and so she found that this anti-Catholic, Catholics would be offended. She's like, did this whole thing. They wouldn't do this to Muslims or Jews. Whole rant. So there's this but this is this is not the only one who said this. There's been people who, particularly conservatives, who've watched Conclave and have accused of being anti-Catholic or anti-religious, woke politics. And there's, on the one hand, that's easy to kind of dismiss, but there is some interesting stuff here that's worth kind of talking about why people perceive it sort of being anti-religious or anti-Catholic. So I want to first, so Houston, talk a bit, because you've done a very positive review for Conclave. So talk a little bit about, your experience watching Conclave, why you liked it, and why you objected to the characterization that the Conclave was sort of anti-religious, anti-Catholic.
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, kind of what I said before, that one of the things I really appreciate about it is how seriously it takes faith and the purpose and significance of the church in the world to do profound good. And like, that's like the status quo of the movie is that the election of a new pope like matters. Like, that's significant and will shape the world. And so we should care about that. And that's like, if you're watching the movie, you're meant to care about that. And so in that way, I think it takes it seriously, but also in a very Christian and very Catholic way, takes seriously the fallenness of men and the fallenness of human beings. And I think asks some really good questions about how do we, we want to build our institutions, especially like if you are a person of faith, there's a desire to build an institution that in some way like honors God or in some way acknowledges the existence of God, especially if you're voting on a new pope, like you're trying to enact a process or a system to somehow engage with the divine, but through like a way that's like a system that you've created. And I don't think that's a bad thing to want, but also how do we do that well? And how do we keep from that system or that institution then becoming God or becoming kind of, actually disconnecting us from God? And I think you see that a lot in the film they're sequestered from kind of reality, basically. The idea is that in order to not influence their judgment on who the new pope should be, all the windows are barred and closed and no light is let in and they can't have any connection to the outside world. There's the Sister Agnes, Isabella Versolini character there's a bird in a cage in her office. And towards the very end, when they finally do vote on the vote is finished and they vote for someone who ends up being kind of a good candidate, that's after the windows have been blown open and you hear bird song outside and the wind kind of comes in almost like the Holy Spirit kind of giving breath to their decision. And so I think even that like was an interesting thing that I loved about it, was like the, engaging with the false divide between the sacred and the secular, and sort of the God's good creation and like the church, which is supposed to be isolated from that or something. But actually these things are meant to coexist. And the final shot speaking to that, with the nuns kind of going back out into the world. But on the like intersex point, I think it's fascinating to me. Well, it's fascinating. I read the book after I saw the movie. And I had thought like there were multiple things about the movie that I did think, maybe this is a little bit like when Ralph Fiennes' character says, I feel like I'm at some sort of American political convention. And I was thinking, did they put that in because it's election year, like to kind of have some social commentary? But actually the book was written in 2015. And so maybe you could say, well, yeah, I was speaking to the 2016 election, but like it wasn't. And also it's fascinating because most of the dialogue, in fact, like it's one of the most, I've never read a book where I've been like, this is exactly the same dialogue as the movie so much before. Like it was so identical down to the kind of treatment of the intersex storyline. But on that point, I find it very silly that, it seems that there's this sort of initial triggering around just the concept of this person being on screen. It's like, it's woke. The mere identity of this person makes it woke. It's a token, whatever. But actually, the funny thing is that the way that the film philosophically deals with Benitez's decision not to have surgery to change his intersex biological functions, he says, I am what God made me. And I felt it would be more of a sin to change God's design than to leave it the way that it was, which aligns with what conservatives want people to think about trans people and all this stuff. And so I'm like, how is this pissing you off? Like, this is like, think about it for more than a second.
Yeah, when I saw the movie, I said to people, maybe that night even, I was like, I'm really curious to know, like, if Catholics who are like just very, or Christians or whoever, like who are anti-trans, are going to be pleased that he chose not to get surgery, or that they're gonna be upset. And I kind of should have known that they would just be upset no matter what, just because there is an intersex person on screen. But yeah, it's I have the same view. Like it's just so it's very interesting the way, and I like the way that they handle it a lot. But yeah.
So it's interesting. Yeah, no, it's funny. One of the things one of the problems with the fact there aren't really like conservative film critics for the most part is that most of the people who are doing film criticism on the right are not film critics. And so really don't have the kind of requisite media literacy to do some of these things well. Because it was funny because, when I was watching, the film, that to me was, I thought, that the least kind of problematic part of it. Because it's like, okay, yeah, like they're, in terms of like, if there's something you can say is sort of anti-religious or problematic about this, because, the problem so much isn't that there's a person who exists who's intersex, or that that person maybe becomes Pope, but that to a certain degree, they do justify hiding it and not allowing that and engaging to some degree in religious political corruption, because there's something positive about the agenda that's being put forward. Again, to the person who is intersex says, in effect, I think the fact that I do have this difference makes it possible for me to reform the church in positive ways. And the thing that, it is easy kind of with conservatives to say, like, one of the things it's like, okay, this is anti-Catholic. It's not anti-Catholic. It's not even anti-Christian. It's anti-conservative Catholic. And I mean that in a very specific way, where it's like the people who are in favor of Latin Mass are mustache twirling villains, which is a kind of funny thing to be like. It's like, the Latin Mass, that is true racism. And so but in that sense, you have sort of conservatives associating their conservatism with what is true religion. It's like it's anti-Catholic if it's anti-conservative Catholic, it's anti-Christian. But on the flip side, to be fair, the movie kind of does that first. Again, it says you're you're a good Catholic if you're liberal, and you're a bad Catholic if you're conservative. Broadly speaking, I'm painting with a broad brush, but it's like, okay, if you are wanting to keep the hierarchy of sort of men and women in the church, if you want to stay with homosexuality, if you want to stay with the Latin Mass, you are a bad Catholic if you're living up to your values. You're a bad liberal Catholic if you're not living up to your values. So to a certain degree, the movie does, it does push you're not actually a good Christian or Catholic if you're not a liberal Christian or Catholic, which is a part and parcel to a certain degree of the toxic aspect of modern politics. We do hear a lot about the sort of problems of Christian nationalism on the right, but you do have, much wider in the mainline denominations, at least in America, more likely to pick your friends based on who your politics are rather than who your religious affiliation is, and other things like that. So there is this kind of your politics, and that's sort of my problem with the movie thematically, because okay, whatever, it's politics. Who cares? I want people to talk about their politics in movies, just like I want them to talk about the religion in movies. But the movie does hit home the necessity of doubt, and the movie never really doubts its chief convictions. Like on politics, they never have a solid counter argument for opposing views that is, not treated sort of with disgust. And, whether it comes with, Lawrence's chief kind of like doubt, which seems to be the church not living up to who it should be or what it should be. They never spend a lot of time with him wrestling with that. Instead, they spend time with him uncovering the corruption and exposing it. So their treatment of the themes of doubt, to me, was incredibly shallow and almost seemed to be, I want people who disagree with me to doubt the things they did, but my core convictions, I don't want to spend a lot of time doubting or giving contrary voice for. So for me, I thought that was, which puts it in a similar problem, although more artistically done, with the God's Not Dead franchise, which is that, I want people who disagree with me to doubt, but I don't want people to disagree with my particular formation of religion and politics. I don't want to spend a lot of time wrestling with my doubts about those convictions. So that's kind of where I saw the bigger problems with the movie. Again, not just from a political level, but from its own thematic, what it is putting forward about itself.
You ready for my counter argument?
I got one too. I'm sorry.
I want to finish my thing. And so that's why I would say that what I would say a lot of people are reacting to and feeling about it, but really just not able to articulate well. Okay, now Houston, you first, and then Jillian.
No, Jillian, go first.
No, I want you to go first because I have a, I guess, tangential question. So we can, go first. Okay. Love to hear your,
I think I definitely understand what you're saying about I think that's a perceptive point about the idea of does the movie, if it's seeing doubt as a virtue, or like, if not doubt, at least like humility, like a sense of like not having complete certainty about your convictions, holding them with kind of open hands. Does it do that? I think one of the things I really appreciate about it is the sense of nuance that is present in the portrayal of all of the cardinals who are vying for the papacy, where it didn't feel to me as at first blush, Stanley Tucci's Bellini is kind of this liberal candidate, and he's poised as kind of the good alternative to Tedesco, who's the cartoonish Trump Pope. But the more that we learn, the more we realize, oh no, he's kind of a coward. He's kind of doing this because he's going to get, and even after he realizes he can't win, he's doing this to get a position in the, cabinet of Tremblay's papacy. Tremblay is also a liberal pope, and he's totally corrupt. And then even with the more conservative ones, granted, there's no empathy really ever given for Tedesco's character. He is kind of a net evil, which is kind of part of the stakes of the movie, right? Is like everyone else is like, we want anything but this guy. And I think we can all relate to that a little bit. But, I think it's still interesting that even with a character like, what's his name? The Nigerian Pope, or Cardinal, trying to blank on his name. Adeyemi, that he is exposed for this kind of sexual scandal and is mentioned as kind of having these very like homophobic views of that gay people should go to prison in this life and hell in the next, or whatever is what Stanley Tucci says about him. And yet he's also treated pretty sympathetically in the movie. Like, we kind of feel the sense of betrayal that he feels in having had this kind of thing set up about him to expose his scandal. And when Ralph Fiennes' character sits and prays with him and kind of tells him like, this isn't going to happen for you, there is this kind of sense of like sympathy that the movie has for him, which I really appreciated. But on the doubt thing, I think this is something I've been thinking about. I think you're very right that it's interesting that Ralph Fiennes' character is kind of seeking certainty the whole movie, like he's seeking to uncover the scandals and make sure that the candidate that they elect does not have any skeletons in the closet and everything. And yet that final beat with Benitez is the thing that then forces him to sit in uncertainty. And I think maybe this is partly because I read the book and I feel like it might be a bit more pronounced in the end of that, but I didn't necessarily feel it as we're hiding that this Pope is intersex. In fact, the book, I think, mentions a lot. I think he says something in the book about like that eventually they'll find out when they do a medical examination on you or something, or like word's going to spread eventually or something. But instead, kind of this sense of open-handedness of like, God, I trust that this is the person who you've put in this position, and I have uncertainty, but I'm giving it to you. And I don't know. So in that way, I think that's what I love about the presence of the fact that the intersex thing isn't just a political thing, but is something that plays into that theme of doubt and uncertainty, where it's like Lawrence has been seeking certainty about the candidate his whole throughout the whole movie, and finally is forced to sit with, this is, the world will make what they will of this, Yeah, I probably have other things to say, but Jillian, you go.
Oh, that's all great. Yeah, I do agree with you, Joseph, in the sense that Conclave is painting the liberal Catholics as the good guys and the conservative Catholics as the bad guys. Like, there's no qualms about that. I do think that it tries, however, to maybe even the playing field a little bit beyond that. And I do think that Bellini is the example of that, just in the way that, like, the Stanley Tucci line delivery when they're like they're convening, and he's like, good on gays, good on women, like, that's it, like, no Latin mass, that's it. And he's like, lean back in his chair like this, just like very casual, direct, as you please. Like, that is a guy that doesn't have doubt. Like, he's self-assured in his beliefs. He's self-assured in the correctness of his beliefs. Like, he's confident in himself. Like, he believes, like, his way is right. He is right. Like, he deserves that power. Like, I think, and he does it in a different way than like Tedesco does, but he still has that like self-assured confidence that, like, no, I'm right, you're wrong, like, that's it. And of course, like, Benitez is more of a reform, like, he believes the same things, like, about reform and all of that. But I do think, like, the intersex thing, he just has more of a quiet, like, peaceful sense about him that the others just don't have, whether it's because they're selfish or power seeking or overconfident or doubting. In the case of Lawrence, like, I think Benitez is the choice because he is open to uncertainty in the ways that the others aren't. And so, yes, he does agree with them, like, in a, like, liberal versus conservative, he's going to be on the liberal side. But I think maybe the important distinction for me is that he doesn't distinguish himself that way, and rather he's like, I'm open to uncertainty. I'm open to what God has to offer. Like, I'm following God's path, whatever that looks like. And so I like that about it. And
so I agree. Sorry, go ahead, finish.
No, go for it.
So yeah, no, I think that's all really great. And I like all that stuff. I guess my distinction to your point, Houston, would be to say that they do show everybody as flawed, but they show the conservatives as flawed for being conservatives. And they show the liberals as flawed for not being liberal enough, in a sense, for not living up to their own values. Whereas the conservatives are flawed because they live up to their values is a political distinction, which is fine, except when the majority of, again, Lawrence's inner conflict is, I'm struggling with doubts. Again, he's a man defined by his doubts. And the two things that are his big convictions of it are, he doesn't spend much of the movie ever doubting. The first is that the gap between the practice of the church and its values is very big. And therefore, I don't know how to reconcile those. He doesn't spend a lot of time actually delving into those or hearing counter arguments to them or anything like that. It's basically just exposing the corruption. He spends most of the time sort of doing that. The other thing is that the movie doesn't, and its movie's biggest convictions are, the church is not living up to its values and liberal politics is right. And it doesn't ever really, go into the ambiguity or show counter arguments to either of those things. Even again, the place where he's going to lean into ambiguity, again, it's very conveniently sort of a liberal coded ambiguity. And there's no wrestling counter argument to that given. There isn't a place where the movie actually challenges the viewers to change their own perspective or practice that, unless, of course, they're sort of on the side that the movie and the book sort of disagrees with. And I think that's worth it to me. Again, it means that, people who have an objection to this movie as saying, kind of in the sort of, the Glinda sense, who say, I'm going to, hey, Alphaba, you will be good and worthwhile once I change everything about you. To a certain degree, that's how reason people are saying, I see this as anti-Christian or anti-Catholic or anti-religious, is there is a sense in which the movie's saying you will be living according to Christ once you change yourself. And then the other point is that I just think as artistically, if you're going to preach doubt and make that one of the central overt themes of the film, wrestling with that throughout the film is probably a better way to go. Now, that said, I'm going to give you guys a chance for some counter argument pushback, but then also, how would you wrap up just kind of the final thoughts about kind of like the Oscars and what you would like to see kind of from the Oscars this year? Do you have a should win, will win? And that's where we'll kind of wrap up there.
My, I guess, final pushback is I think I could write 10,000 words about the character of Lawrence and how he's so interesting and I agree with you that he doesn't have time to doubt, but I think that's like the conceit of his character is that he like wants time to doubt, but he can't because he has to keep doing his job, like they're like, pick the Pope, Lawrence, and he's like, no, I need time to like have an existential crisis. Like, anyway, I think he's very fascinating. But I understand what you mean, but I think that's I don't know. I think, and that shifts away from a movie lens and more of a character lens, which is a whole other thing. But I think, so we kind of started the conclave conversation by talking about people who were vehemently opposed to it and who were like, this is just unacceptable. But I think Challengers, again, was a cultural touchpoint movie of last year, and I'll stand by that till the day I die. But I think Conclave became another one in ways that were unexpected. And I think maybe this is revealing my hand that I haven't seen a lot of hate for it, but rather people that are like, I'm an ex-Catholic and I saw this movie and this has like gotten me interested in Catholicism again. Like this has gotten me interested in Christianity again. Like this is making me want to consider faith and consider the institution of religion and all of that. Not to say that people are like flocking to the churches, but I think it's created an open dialogue in ways that a lot of other movies haven't, especially when it comes to religion. So I guess I'm curious. I think that has that's a positive impact to me because I think discussing religion at all is good. But I think especially when you've reached a community that has normally felt not welcome to discuss religion or, not inclined to discuss religion. And suddenly they're like interested in discussing religion and interested in discussing their past with religion, like what it means to them, all of that. I think that that's like a net good. And I think that that's a really interesting side effect of the movie. And I think it, the popularity of like Succession and family dramas and dramas like this that kind of aligned to where Conclave could hit the like 20-something, 30-something film Twitter, essentially. I think that that's really interesting and really cool. So I'm curious if you guys think that that specific phenomenon will have more long-lasting effects or like impacts on the film world or anything like that. Is my last kind of thought about Conclave.
Yeah, those are great words about it. I feel like I am in such agreement that I feel like I've just had so many great conversations about the movie with people. And I feel like it does ask a lot of really good questions. And I think to your point, Joseph, I think it probably does take for granted certain aspects of disagreement with an extreme fundamentalist conservatism. But I also think I'm in that camp and a lot of people are. And so for those of us who are, we go, there's a ton of conversation to be had here. Like we can all kind of take that as a given and still have a conversation about all the rest of this, like sort of that is less certain or whatever. And even with the character of Lawrence, I think I totally agree that I could write 10,000 words about him. I feel like the first time I saw it, I thought he was pretty innocuous in terms of his character, but in seeing it again, I've just been like, I am so compelled by his sense of trying to fulfill this duty he feels that he's been called to do, but not knowing if he's the right person for it. And that question of, does he have this ambition inside of him, or is he just being like, are the other people just kind of blaming him for that, for their own ambition? And then these kind of broader questions about church abuse scandals and stuff, where there's these questions of, when do I act to expose something and bring to light injustice and evil as a service to the truth and to, bringing those things into the light? And when is it best to let God handle that and not be the judge, and when is it, like the fact that he blacks out the names of the cardinal, he doesn't want to expose all the cardinals who were given money to vote for Tremblay. He's trying to sort of like play this, and then all these situations where, like Bellini is telling him, don't expose this because it'll make the church look so bad, and that sort of thing. But then being like, well, but if it's the truth, should we, and I just think that's an interesting other conversation that the movie brings up around some of these obviously wider church abuse scandals, where it's like sometimes people are told, well, don't bring that up because it'll sully the name of this person and that's going to hurt the gospel and that sort of thing. And yet also, is there a limit to how far we should pursue dragging every skeleton out of the closet, and when should we just let God be the judge or whatever? That's all really interesting to me. I think, yeah, with your question, it's been really fascinating to see people flock to it, and people, I've seen so much Conclave fan art. I'm like, I don't have the money for this, but someone has made they've made like a hardcover zine, like, where it's like over 70 pages of Conclave fan art. And it's $50, but the money all goes to like an intersex charity or something. And I'm like, I'll send you the link after.
That would be great.
I think the link, I still have it open in my tabs.
Awesome.
It's Conclave Zine, ZINE .bigcartel.com.
Okay, cool.
But anyway, that's been fast, because I'm sure the vast majority of people doing the fan art for that are not religious, but were somewhat compelled by it. And it seems that in some of those cases, there's sort of like they love the homoerotic like undertones of like all these celibate like priests and Stanley Tucci having this kind of latent gay energy or something. But I think as well, and then as well, I think there's like an aesthetic component of like, it's just a strong aesthetic, like, and it feels like it lends itself to anime or something. And yet I also think it is it feels like a pretty universal parable about kind of where we're at right now. And I think a lot of people can project their own, kind of wrestles into it, and wishes for, I mean, if the church is kind of a analogous for the country, in the movie, wishing for a leader that we can actually trust and feel safe and, like a sense of hope around, right? Like, and in that way, I think the ending feels a bit like a Tolkien eucatastrophe kind of moment, where it's like all the things point to the Pope has to be someone who's just, got a bunch of skeletons in the closet, but we're presented with this person who's actually good. Like, and I think it's interesting as well. Sorry, I need to stop. But I one thing that I was thinking of that you were saying about Benitez is, like, we don't actually know that he's that liberal. Like, we know that he voted for Lawrence, and we know that he like established hospitals for victims of victims of sexual violence, and that he's kind of got like a broadly kind of like anti-war kind of peacemaking perspective. But I've always thought it would be funny if there was an epilogue where it was like, and he was more homophobic than all of them. Like, we don't actually know where he stands on these things. And in that way, he, like you mentioned, he kind of represents certain liberal talking points around the intersex piece and that kind of thing. Although, of course, I go, that shouldn't be political, but of course it is. But at the same time, we theologically, it feels that he's chosen the reason that we like him by the end of the movie is the content of his character, not necessarily his political persuasion around where the church should go or whatever. Yeah. Anyway, I'll stop there. You asked another question about.
Yeah. So final kind of thoughts on analysis and also hopes for the Oscars, like who hope will win and who should win.
Well, I think it's clear that Houston and I both are Conclave supporters. I think that
what do we call conclave heads? What do we call conclave heads? Like,
yeah. I think we've like showed our hands, I think, in a very clear way in the past 20 minutes or so, 30 minutes maybe. But yeah, I think the other thing, which is totally disconnected for me, is I'm really excited about the horror movies that are nominated. I love religious horror, and none of the movies this year are particularly religious horror, but I think that horror deserves to be considered in the Academy as well as anything. And I think there are certain shifts that are making it happen now more than ever, including the fact that like horror is becoming a little more highbrow than it has been the past 20, 30 years and all of that. But if I recall correctly, Get Out was the last time that a horror movie was nominated in a real way. And I mean, that incredible movie which deserved it 10 times over. But I'm pleased about the horror nominations. I don't know that necessarily they were my favorite movies of the year, but I would like them to get awards so that horror movies keep getting nominated, just because I'm pleased in that shift overall. But yeah, I'm curious to see what will win. I feel like Emilia Perez is both a controversial and a last minute kind of rise, like for it to be the most nominated movie of the year when people are either like, I haven't heard of this movie.
But it's worse than Megalopolis.
I saw this movie and I didn't like it. Yeah. That's really interesting. And so I'm curious if it's going to win. Like, I'm curious, like the stuff that got nominated is interesting. And I'm curious, like, what's going to come out on top. I'm always curious. So anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm trying to sort of unpack. We need to not go down the Emilia Perez trail.
Yeah.
We could talk for another hour about that. I know.
Right.
I just don't understand what's going on. I'm like, what do you guys see in this?
But again, no challengers. So what does it matter? I'm just kidding.
Honestly. Charitably, I think I think they just want to give a middle finger to Trump, and it features both trans people and Mexican people. And so it's kind of like, this is, but the irony, of course, is that trans people hate it and Mexican people hate it. So it's very performative in that way.
But Netflix has a really good marketing budget.
Yeah, exactly. Now, that was the other ironic thing someone said, was that Netflix has had several years now where they've had a movie get a bunch of nominations: The Irishman, Marriage Story, a few other things, Roma, and then not win, like basically get everything but winning. And that might happen again this year. Yeah, I am pretty pro Conclave. I think it would be just a very kind of, everyone would be okay with it. Like, no one would be mad if Conclave won. At the same time,
except for Megyn Kelly, of course.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's true. We've mentioned all the people who would be mad. But I also think Dune would be fun. Like, it would be really fun. It's not going to win, but it would just be fun for Dune Part 2, because I think out of all the movies on this list, I go, that's probably the like long-term classic. Like, I think the trilogy is going to be remembered in the same breath as Lord of the Rings. Like, so maybe that'll happen when Dune Messiah comes out.
I personally, Dune Part 2 would be my pick out of the picks that they have this year. It's not going to happen. This is one of the reasons why I don't think they should have less director nominations than Best Picture nominations, is it's not going to win if it's got Best Picture nomination but not Best Director nomination. It's the same thing that happened last year with Barbie. It was like, we know this is... Yeah, I know.
Yeah. And
I guess Josh Brolin's not going to get to act anymore. But don't look up that controversy. I'm not going to explain it. Anyway, but... I think it is interesting. I'm really excited to see what happens to the Oscars this year. I think that where religion goes is interesting. Again, it's interesting. You kind of mentioned that they do kind of assume that certain fundamentalist kind of Christian ideas are not are kind of are outside, not going to kind of question that. But what's interesting is that, that's the way those kind of fundamentalist conservatives are more the way that the most of the world is going. And even sort of in the West, the denominations that are growing are more in line kind of with the religious views of the ones that they say are outside the mainstream. So I kind of think it's interesting how, even though last year there was a sense in which, with Oppenheimer winning, the Academy was coming a little bit more toward, and the sort of the majority population were coming a bit more towards each other. It seems like we're looking like the Academy is now starting to split off a little bit more culturally from the rest of the country and from kind of the world in general, which is just fascinating to me, again, as somebody who wants to continue to write about this for a very long time, to watch these cultural trends. But yeah. All right. Cool. Well, this has been awesome. Thank you so much, Houston, for joining us. This was a great discussion. Yeah. Very much enjoyed it. And,
thanks for having me.
Yeah. Anything that you want us to promote because this is going to come out sometime in February, anything you want us to promote for you, or if people want to check you out or find your stuff, where can they go?
Yes. So my YouTube channel is Houston Coley. If you'd like to find out more about my movie, which is A Kingdom of Tea and Strangers, it's labri.documentary.com, L-A-B-R-I documentary.com. And we are kind of scheduling various screenings with churches and other community groups and stuff around the country. If you'd want to host your own, it will be online sometime around May. I think that's kind of what we're aiming for, which I'm excited about. I'm trying to figure out whether to classify it as a 2024 movie or a 2025 movie, because we've had screenings in 2024, but I think technically the public release will be 2025. So, I'm excited for it to come out. But yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
thanks for doing this, Joseph. Our gracious host, as always.
It is an honor and a privilege, and it's an honor and privilege to talk to you all out there. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the Religion Unplugged podcast, your one-stop shop for all the best religious news and culture.